Come, Holy Spirit, speak to our hearts now as we listen to your word and seek a thought from you that we may adjust our lives in function of eternity. In the 17th chapter of Ecclesiasticus, Ben Sirach, we have these words: "The Lord fashioned human beings from the earth to consign them back to it. He gave them so many days and so much time." Words that we can take with us in the heart of this retreat. We don't quite know how much time. In this context, it can help us to profit from the fact that some things have come back from the beyond, contextualizing our existence in that wider frame. As we know, the illness of modern man is that he is, at least in the civilized world, so-called, orientated towards the immediate exclusively, and fails to see the wider picture. And so a few things, interesting questions, are found in this manuscript that I translated, in which I often use in Retreat word because it helps us to see things as they are. The question there: how far is it from the world in which we live to purgatory? Now that's framing the question in geographical, physical terms. And yet it's not entirely without relevance, because there is movement. Those who do have clinical death will tell you that the soul does come out and moves on. Purgatory is in the center of the globe. So when one talks about going up or going down, it is not without relevance, especially if one collocates the lowest part close precisely to the other place, which is not good news. But then there is the question of doing our purgatory here on earth, accepting suffering, being perfect in charity, accepting the divine will. There are bypasses of purgatory that we need to take on board. The question of sudden deaths. Deaths that are sudden and unforeseen. Are they acts of God's justice or of His mercy? And the question comes back in this form. The answer is, deaths of this sort are sometimes an act of justice and sometimes an act of mercy. When a soul is of a worrying nature, and God knows that it is prepared and ready to appear before Him, in order to spare it the frights it might have at the final moment, He withdraws it from this world by a sudden death. And at other times, God takes souls away in His justice. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're utterly lost, but deprived as they are of the last sacraments, or having received them hastily, and that is a great sadness to priests, that we meet people in a state when we can't really get through to them. It's too late to do a proper preparation at that point. We need their lucidity. So, without having prepared themselves for the last crossing, that is with lucidity, their purgatory is considerably more painful and goes on for a longer time. Others, having reached the very limit with their crimes and remained deaf to every single God-given grace are removed from the world, God takes them off, lest they excite his vengeance even further. And by that is intended that there are levels also in hell. And so if a soul is continuously refusing the solicitations of grace, it can be that an early death can save that soul from an even worse loss. Because as there are levels in purgatory, levels in hell, there are also levels in heaven, and vice versa. We know that the spiritual senses that correspond to the physical senses are recompensed or tormented in exact proportion to what they have merited. The fire of purgatory, is it a fire like the one we know on earth? Yes, only with the difference that the fire of purgatory is a purifier that has to do with the justice of God, and that of the earth, nice and gentle, compared with purgatories. It's but a shadow beside the great braziers of divine justice, and that should be borne in mind before watering down the doctrine of purgatory. It's serious stuff. But how on earth can a soul burn anyway? By a just permission of God. The soul, that is, the guilty partner, since all the body did was obey. And what malice do you ever see shown to a dead body? The soul suffers as though it were the body that suffered. Tell me, asks the living nun, what takes place during the last agony and in the time that follows? Does the soul find itself in the light or in darkness? Under what form is the sentence pronounced? I had no agony, as you know, but I am able to tell you that at this last decisive moment, the devil lets out all his fury on the dying. We priests can tell pretty quickly if we have the soul still lucid whether they have taken seriously the sacrament of confession during their life or not. And one can detect from certain signals whether they're in light or darkness, at least tendentially. I remember some time ago being called to a nursing home not far from where I am to prepare two ladies. One was lucid and received the last sacraments with great gratitude and serenity. The other, realizing who and what was there, started to swear terribly and refused the sacraments. It's not the best way to die. I had no agony. So this goes on to what happens one moment after death, agony or not. In order to give souls greater merit, God allows them to undergo these last hours of testing, these last battles. Strong and generous souls, so that they may have a yet more glorious place in heaven, often have at life's end and during the pangs of death a taste of these terrible fights against the angel of darkness. You yourself have been a witness to the fact, but they come through it victoriously. The reactions that souls have before great suffering is very unequal. There was a lady whom I had helped for years, and she was going down bit by bit because of the degenerative diseases that she had. But she had a great capacity to suffer physical pain and would never ever complain. A really heroic soul. And in the end she was in a hospice, so I went down to prepare her for I knew was going to be the last time, and she was still perfectly lucid. And when I was giving her the last sacraments, I was about to apply them, a family member phoned, and I could understand the question, "How are you?" And she serenely answered, "Not great." That's the maximum that came out of her with regard to a complaint ever. And before petering out, she calmly said, "You've been very good," and died. God doesn't allow a soul who has been faithful to him throughout her life to be lost in these final moments. Those who have loved the Blessed Virgin, who have invoked her all through their lives, receive many graces from her during these last struggles. The same is true of those who have been devoted to St. Joseph, St. Michael, or some other saint. Another close friend of mine, who's been very good all these years, and his widow, still very good, had a huge devotion to St. Joseph. He would always say the complete mantle of St. Joseph. It takes about half an hour a day. And he was suddenly moved to hospital because he certainly wasn't well. He received all the sacraments with complete lucidity, and during the night his eyes opened and he said to those around, "St. Joseph, can you see St. Joseph?" And he closed his eyes. St. Joseph had come for him. It is then, as I've said to you already, that one is glad to have an intercessor before God in this painful moment. There are souls who die in peace, without experiencing anything of what I've just described. The good Lord has his designs in everything. He does or permits everything for the particular good of each. How am I to tell you and describe to you what takes place after the agony? It isn't possible to understand it properly without having gone through it. I'll try, nevertheless, to explain it to you as best I can. The soul, as it leaves its body, has a feeling of being utterly bewildered, completely besieged, if I may so speak, by God. It finds itself in such lucidity that in the twinkling of an eye it perceives its whole life. Now that is a constant. People who have had a clinical death start to see things as they are, including the whole of their life. So, it perceives its whole life and, in accordance with what it sees, what it deserves. Notice this bit. It's the soul itself that in the midst of such a clear sight pronounces its own sentence. It just sees things as they are, and the consequences follow. It does not actually see God, but is annihilated by his presence. If it is a guilty soul, as was my own case, and in consequence has merited purgatory, it is so crushed down by the weight of its faults, still remaining to be effaced, that it plunges itself of its own accord into purgatory. It is then, and then only, that one understands God, His love for souls, and how wretched sin is in the eyes of His divine majesty. St. Michael is there when the soul leaves the body. It is him alone that I saw, and that all souls see. He is, as it were, the witness and the executioner of divine justice. I also saw my guardian angel. All this is to help you to understand how it is that it can be said that St. Michael carries our souls to purgatory. Because the soul can't be carried. Yet, nonetheless, it's true, inasmuch as he is there, present at the execution of the sentence. All that goes on in the other world is a mystery for yours. And then, of course, there's a question of how much do we know in purgatory? Are people's faults known to everyone in purgatory, as they will be at the last judgment? And that, by the way, to some extent, is backdrop to the difference between the particular judgment and the universal judgment, that the Lord will, at the last day, allow us to see more than just what concerns us immediately, out of, in a way, fairness. Because our sins affect each other, and we have a right to know some of the consequences. Sin and merit are not just private affairs. So the answer comes back. Generally speaking, we don't know the faults of others in purgatory, except, that is, when God permits it, with regard to certain souls, for His own designs. But it's only with a small number of souls that He acts in this way. Who can fathom God's judgments? Who can comprehend the purity that He requires of a soul before He admits it to participation in His eternal happiness? And something of that also applies to us priests as we approach the Holy of Holies. We need to be aware that the angels are around us, and something of their angelic purity should be in us. We're in another company at the altar. Alas, if people only reflected on these things while yet on earth, what a life they would lead. Examine seriously how many venial sins a negligent person, one who is little concerned for his salvation and is well glued to the earth, commits in one day. How many minutes does he give to God? Does he as much as think of Him with reflection? Think hard. Contemplate 365 days of this kind in one year. And if a large number of years follow the same pattern, this person dies with the soul loaded with a multitude of venial sins which haven't been effaced because the thought never came to him. I remember in class years ago in France, Augustin, our teacher, telling us with regard to this distinction between venial sins and mortal sins, that it wasn't correct to just presume that one could easily commit these venial sins. He just said it this way: on n'a pas le droit de commettre des péchés veniels. In other words, if we are coherent, a venial sin is grave enough for a consecrated, because it's a blockage to love. Therefore, comes into this situation with all these yet to be sorted. Only just is there left in the soul, thus overridden, one tiny flicker of love when it comes to give an account of its life to the one who requires it back again. You have before you all these almost worthless lives which have to be lived all over again in expiation, lives devoid of love of God, of purity of intention. The soul, which must live on God, has not lived for him. It has therefore to start its life all over again, and that with unheard of sufferings. It didn't take advantage of divine mercy upon earth. It was a slave to its body. Once in the place of purifying, it has to make satisfaction right down to the last mite, and find once more its first splendour. This for those that are indifferent with regard to their salvation, but for the souls that are yet more guilty still, it's another matter. Nowadays, there has been, through the messages given funeral after funeral, the understanding that everyone gets there. And we've had in Ireland the situation where suicide has become quite fashionable and has been, yes, indirectly encouraged, not willingly, but concretely, by the fact that young people are being given a huge send-off after committing it, no matter how much pain they've left in the family. Young people now easily take their lives for motives of unrequited love and betrayal in that domain. That happened one day when somebody's girlfriend was going off to somebody else. The person took weed killer, which does not spare, but got such a glorious send-off at the funeral that a friend of his who was there went off with himself and was so impressed with the funeral that he wanted a similar send-off himself and threw himself in the Boyne River. A lot of my priest friends have to handle a lot of suicides. It's heavy, heavy going for a priest. We were given guidelines actually as to how to do and how not to do in these situations. It's not easy, but one must be careful not to encourage suicide by a false message. All the power of Shakespeare hangs on the fact that he was a crypto-Catholic. That we know. Up in the north, they would sometimes conform externally to keep a low profile. We have his signature in the Venerable English College in Rome, so he was there for a while, out of trouble's way. At his death, a Protestant friend in the area muttered, "William died a papist." So all his Catholic faith comes through his writings. Clever. He used literature as his pulpit. But some of the most powerful words ever written have come from his pen. Listen to conclude to the famous soliloquy of Hamlet before committing suicide or not. To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. To die, to sleep, no more. And by asleep, to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. There's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his creators make with a bare bodkin. Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard, their currents turn awry and lose